Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Illionis.
Selamat pagi, good morning, Marc and Andrew, Pak Kodes, Pak Sofia, Mas Gamal, Bapak Ibu yang terhormat sekalian, please allow me to speak in bahasa Indonesia. Okay. Ini suatu kehormatan yang besar sekali bisa bersama-sama dengan tim Smart City bersama Marc, Doussard, Ph.D, and Andrew Greenlee, Ph.D, from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. On Monday, this morning for, what you call it, this is public lectures? Yep, okay. Bersama teman-teman dari Universitas Indonesia dan rekan-rekan lainnya. Dan ini adalah kesempatan yang baik sekali. We would like to hear your wisdom, your experience on this planning local and regional economic development. Untuk pengenalan bahwa program SHERA itu adalah program grant 5 tahun untuk kolaborasi research antar perguruan tinggi Indonesia dan US, kemudian juga melibatkan pemerintah daerah, private sectors, dan juga local communities. Untuk UI, mereka waktu itu adalah berkompetisi dengan B, dan the competition begins like 48 competitors to get this award. So they won the bid for the $3 million research partnerships. So and then we have 5 topics at this time, like urban development, so they are the winners, and the ketahanan pangan, marines, environment, innovation technology, dan medicals, yang masing-masing akan dipimpin oleh perguruan tinggi yang cukup bergengsi di Indonesia. Kami bangga dengan capaian UI yang di-lead oleh tim Profesor Herian Macha dan Mas Gamal di sini. Dalam perjalanan 2 tahun ini kita melihat bahwa terjadi banyak capaian-capaian, tapi juga masih banyak capaian yang harus ditarget lagi, dan semoga dengan kegiatan ini bisa mendukung lebih baik. Dan perlu juga untuk diperhatikan bahwa perkembangan dari USAID itu perlu diikuti, perkembangan dari Amerika Indonesia perlu diikuti kemana arah kebijakan, and also we would like to hear from you how this public lecture can also benefit all of the listeners, dan juga bisa meningkatkan pengetahuan teman-teman semua. So congratulations for Smart City to having this public lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Illionis. Ladies and gentlemen, now that we have heard the welcome remarks, we would like to invite the Vice Dean of Academic Division of Faculty of Engineering Universitas Indonesia, Dr. Muhammad Asfial, to commence the start of the lecture.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, good morning, especially our guests from University of Illinois Auburn, Dr. Marc Doussard and also Dr. Andrew Greenlee, and also all audience, not only from Universitas Indonesia but also from other institutions in Indonesia. We are very happy today, two guests, professor from University of Illinois can share us about the concept of smart city and related topics, and of course, we need your sharing about your experience, especially in your country, and how about in Indonesia case. Professor Marc Doussard, Associate Professor from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, He will share us today morning, the topic about the planning, local and regional economic development. And the second one is Professor Andrew Greenlee, also assistant professor from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The topic today is housing policy and the governance of neighborhood change. I will introduce a little bit about our university. Universitas Indonesia is one of the oldest university in Indonesia, and also based on the KS World University ranking and also Time Higher Education ranking. Universitas Indonesia is the best, the #1 university in Indonesia. Currently, we have almost 55,000 students, separate from 14 faculties. And Faculty of Universitas Indonesia, one of the biggest faculty in Universitas Indonesia. We have 6,200 students now, in this semesters, undergraduate students, master, and also PhD students. We have commitments for internationalizations education in our faculty, and not only our faculty but also our university. We have some students from other countries study in our faculty in engineering fields. They come from France, from Germany, from Korea, from Japan, from Thailand and other countries, mixed both country from Indonesia. And also we have collaboration already with University of Florida in terms of academic and research, and of course, with University of Illinois at Urbana, we can propose something like that, in academic and also research collaboration. We have also collaboration with Aalborg University, and some our professors graduated from US, university in US, from Florida, from Berkeley, from Ohio State University, from Oklahoma State University, and also Texas at Clinton University in US. We are very happy, because we have some professors graduated from US. That is our commitments, of course, to propose collaboration with some university in US. Smart City, and of course, thank you very much, Pak Prima, from USAID Indonesia, for supporting this project. I don't know this is project or not, the Smart City, in led by Universitas Indonesia. We are very happy, and once again, thank you very much, supporting from USAID. Smart City is a center for collaborative research, focusing on urban development, funded by USAID through SHERA project. The goal is to encourage researchers to collaborate and create innovations as a response to global and Indonesian urban challenges. Smart City have been collaborating with state universities, one of them being University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a research university from the top 50 university in the world. We are very happy. Thank you very much. And Smart City is collaborating with the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, which is beneficial to the growth of College of Engineering in Universitas Indonesia for sustainable urban development. Learning and insight regarding local and regional development and housing policy can help us understand the scope in which we can contribute as engineers to the urban development. I think especially our guests from University of Illinois, the urban development is still a problem in our country. Probably you got some information about the problem urban in Indonesia. That is the commitment. Some professors, some researchers in our country, especially in Faculty of Engineering in Universitas Indonesia. Their focus research, how to develop, to do research related to urban problem, especially in Indonesia case. Professor Marc Doussard is a scholar of economic development that speaks directly to the role that economic fairness and social equity play in the building economies. His current project includes the spread of human development ideas within the economic development practice based on census microdata to determine whether innovation actually creates jobs in the place that support it. And Professor Greenlee's research lies at the intersection of housing policy, community development, and social equity in planning. His research examines the influence of housing policy on neighborhood change processes. His work is informed by a desire to use planning tools and analysis strategies to better understand and articulate the equity implication of federal, state, and also local policies. Once again, thank you very much to Professor Marc Doussard and also Professor Andrew Greenlee. Yeah, the apologies from our dean. Yeah, he couldn't join us today morning because he have another meeting in the upstairs. Yeah, but we hopefully, yeah, the facility from Professor Doussard and also Professor Andrew, yeah, we can propose collaboration, yeah, in terms of academic and also research between our universities, yeah, and also your university. We have double degree program with some university in the world, yeah, especially in Australia, in Germany, yeah, in France and other countries, yeah. And of course, yeah, this idea we can propose is the same idea, I mean, yeah, double degree program, joint degree program, and also, of course, yeah, collaboration in research, especially related to the urban development topics. To all audience, yeah, thank you very much for attending this public lectures, yeah, led by Dr. Gamal and others, yeah, under the Smart City project in Universitas Indonesia. And hopefully, yeah, you can elaborate and ask everything, yeah, related to this topic, yeah, to the two guests, Professor today morning. And of course, yeah, hope you enjoy, yeah, in these public lectures, yeah, any ideas, yeah, because the audience is not come from Universitas Indonesia, but also from other institutions, yeah, in Indonesia. We can propose any ideas, especially for our collaborations. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Officially, the Smart City Public Lecture officially is open. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Mr. Asdel, for the commencement. Now, to inform the audience, the live streaming of the public lecture section is available in this link, bit.ly/PLSE 2019, and the audience are expected to open it for like 1 to 3 minutes in order to use up the streaming section of the public lecture. Without further ado, let's proceed with our first speaker for today, Mr. Marc Doussard, Ph.D., who will lecture us about planning local and regional economic development. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Marc Doussard.
Bapak Ibu semua, mohon maaf saya harus tetap di kelas stand or sit. Ya, teman-teman.
You're the operator, so I have to call it slide you. Okay. First of all, thank you to everybody for bringing us here. Thank you, Mr. Dean, Mr. Vice Dean, Professor Hari, Professor Gamal. This is wonderful. And yet, when I was asked to speak here, the question is always what the experience of economic development in the U.S. can say for Indonesia. I think, to say the obvious, we're extremely different countries. And one of the challenges really is that when people try to think about how to improve the economy here, how to develop, how to grow, how to do the human things we all want to do, the theories and the ideas you have to use inevitably come from the US, where we are so extraordinarily different. So today, I'm not going to propose anything about what I understand about Indonesia, because I understand very little at all, and I would not presume to do so. But what I do want to share with you is the way that ideas in the US about economic development are changing, and changing rather quickly. This is important because inevitably, our ideas, for better and quite often rather, for worse, become the ideas that you all have to work with, that the world has to work with. So the title of my talk is about finding development and economic development in the US, because development is not something we have done well historically. We don't think about development, growth, change, and industrialization. We typically think about very narrow issues in terms of where to fund real estate development or other things. What I want to establish for you today is that this is changing in rather remarkable ways. And what I want to show you in particular is that the best guide to understanding where the US is in economic development is now Amartya Sen, right? So a scholar of the Global South, a scholar of places very much not like the US, and yet his ideas describe what is happening in the US probably more accurately than the old ideas we've had. Thank you. So the way to think about my talk might be like this. What happens to an economy after it is all the way developed? Now, development is never neat, it's never tidy, you never end up at the end state in which you think you will. And yet the promise of ending up at an end state is what motivates almost all of us. I spent most of my adult life in Chicago, which looks like this. It's no longer an industrial city. It is now a source of advanced global and producer services, startup companies, and so forth. And this is important because Chicago and cities like it have won the game of economic development as far as it goes. They have grown, they've diversified, they've moved from extraction industries to manufacturing to advanced services. And so the question becomes, thank you, she's reading my mind, it's truly excellent. The question becomes, what happens next after you have supposedly developed? And in the US, as you may know, we're having a rather difficult time with this. So, back up, yeah, sorry. To go through things, and here's some of the things I'm going to talk about today. We recently had a situation in the United States where Amazon World Headquarters was put out to bid. Which city wants it? Rather remarkably, most cities did not want Amazon. This would be something that you would think in terms of conventional economic development would be great for a city, and yet residents in New York rejected Amazon because they fear that the development would not benefit them. This is not something we're supposed to know from development, but it's a reality we're dealing with. The US is now, like many places, is bustling with the so-called maker movement, where people can now do as individuals, as entrepreneurs, the work that large manufacturing enterprises used to. This is a useful way of diversifying our economies, and yet it's not creating any jobs, and it's not even creating wealth for the people who do it. Student debt has emerged as a major issue in the United States, and it's something that we previously thought of as separate from economic development, and yet we are now recognizing that it's economically inefficient. In the midst of all this, you have events like this, where the state of Wisconsin gave $4 billion to Foxconn to build a factory. Did I lose this? I lost it. Try this one. Sorry about that. Where a US state subsidized a manufacturer for $4 billion, and the manufacturer did not even come. So these are some of the issues that the supposedly all the way developed US is facing. What I want to do today is walk you briefly through these issues It suggests that human development is the best way to understand our challenges in the north, if you will. Next slide. And the way I'm going to do this is by tracing a city that I think is emblematic of these changes, which is Seattle, Washington. This is a fairly routine photo of Seattle just 50 years ago. It was, to put it, I don't know how you put it, it wasn't a terribly nice place. It was known for paper manufacturing. It was not a destination city for any tourists. It did not have good education industries or anything else really. Today, of course, this is Seattle. It's the site of all kinds of immigration, global wealth, and new services development. It's one of the premier growth cities in the US, and as such, it's a winner of economic development, and yet this is the site where all of our current controversies and changes are most manifest. So just to give you, so here are more ideas. Seattle historically was known in our country for paper manufacturing and aircraft manufacturing. In the scheme of US industrial uses, aircraft manufacturing had some technological benefits. The other was known primarily for pollution. 50 years ago, the population of the region was 1.4 million. Moving to today, the Seattle region is pushing 4 million people. Now, I recognize this would not be a fast rate of growth for a city in Indonesia, but for the US, this is tripling in size, is an extraordinary growth rate, frankly. The economy is extraordinarily diversified. It's full of, it's of course Amazon headquarters and the headquarters of lots of e-commerce. It has Microsoft and software industries, biotechnology, diversified finance industries, outdoor equipment manufacturing, all kinds of things that are new and forward-looking industries. So Seattle is your success story. This is a routine picture of the skyline. There are more cranes than you can count, which is the sign of a healthy economy. So Seattle, if you see it this way, this thing here is Amazon headquarters, just to let you know. Seattle's won the game of traditional economic development. Nearly half of the adults in Seattle have college degrees. It draws international migrants and investors and domestic immigrants. It features new sunrise industries, that is, industries that are growing and immune from cost-based competition. In jobs, population, wages, every single thing about it continues to grow, and quite quickly. And yet Seattle has two major problems that for its residents overshadow these benefits. The first is that few workers, quite simply put, earn enough to pay the rent or to buy a home. The second problem is that today's sunrise industries will not be sunrise industries for long. Industries mature and they cease to drive the wealth which you associate with them. So Seattle faces the challenge of updating and renewing its industries. And these are the two real questions. How can the city continue to grow and prosper? How can the people in the city grow and prosper? And how can it renew what it does so that it doesn't become an old city with old industries? So the old approach to economic development, interestingly enough, was developed in Seattle, which is part of why I chose it. Our old theories were based on the forests of the Pacific coast of the US and Canada. And the growth of cities in that region looks a lot like the developmental economics with which you here will be familiar. It started with extraction industries and just the crudest forms of logging. Eventually these cities added some kinds of manufacturing and refining services, and then eventually they branched out into tertiary services, right? Into finance, into insurance, into things that are kind of the new industries for the world. In this context, the goal of public policy in the US could be summed up by the idea that a so-called rising tide lifts all boats. This is the great aphorism of economic development in the United States. The goal of public policy was to support manufacturing firms. Work was stable, so all that public policy had to do was find work for people. That work paid enough to feed yourself, it paid enough to shelter yourself, it was stable, and it was presumed to be lifelong. Major manufacturers defined places, So I live in the Midwest of the United States now. Every city, every town had a manufacturer with which it was associated. The problem, of course, is that most of those manufacturers have moved and there's nothing that's come to replace them. So this old approach to economic development in the US had many flaws, but it was coherent. You had this linear theory of development which we exported to the world. It might have described our poor part of the world with reasonable accuracy. These ideas about development lose a lot of their power once you step outside of the United States. So the new approach to economic development is one in which scholars are moving from ideas about human capital and manufacturing capital to ideas about human development. And let me be clear here, I'm not saying that this is where scholars and practitioners should move. I'm not saying this is what they should do. I'm saying that this is in fact how they are beginning to think in the US, which is a remarkable development. Human capital theories were the first way we tried to get past old ideas about resources and manufacturing. The idea in these theories was to focus policy and research on globalization, on innovation, and on the sources of knowledge and economic growth and diversification, right? The idea of human capital was that people, not physical things, are the source of economic wealth. The problem with this theory in the United States, of course, is that the US systematically underinvests in human capital. So even as scholars talked about how important it was, and cities were, we were cutting budgets for schools, we were cutting budgets for universities, and we were cutting budgets for public housing, childcare, and other things that allow people to recognize and develop their human capital. So this is kind of the animating challenge in the US and a lot of what people in Seattle have been responding to. The best way to understand these changes, I would argue, is a pretty simple one with which I hope you're familiar, and this would be simply the ideas of human development developed by Amartya Sen and elaborated by some other people. Human development theory was used to explain and support the goal of giving people rights and the capability to determine their own lives. The argument was that what's doing good for people individually is in fact good for the economy. These ideas apply to the US now as well as the developing world, essentially. And they provide, I will argue, the clearest way to understand four major challenges facing the economies in US cities. And I'm going to walk you through these challenges very briefly. So what are the problems US economies face that threaten their future growth and diversification? First would be a declining pace of innovation. Simply put, when economists and scholars look around, they recognize that what seems to be a perpetually innovative US economy is in fact no such thing, and that the pace and the potential for future high technology innovations to propel the economy forward are in fact shrinking. This is a source of concern because it suggests that the potential to grow our economy, remember we do not grow by population growth or other things, we have to grow by knowledge, that the potential to grow this way is limited. The second component, quite simply, is that urban economies in the US face a threat from inequality. One way to put it is simply that 1/3 of our population really is not economically productive. The people who spend their time in the US, which may be hard to believe, worrying about where they're going to get their next meal, worrying about where they're going to sleep that night, are not productive members of the economy. So these are two major areas of concern. And I'm going to walk you through four areas where they manifest. The maker movement, I know the second topic will be controversial here. It is not controversial in the US. That is the legalization of... Was I cut off intentionally? The second issue would be the legalization of marijuana, which I am not prescribing, but noting is something that is happening in the US, and I'm going to explain to you why it's happening as a source of economic growth. Third is the passage of $15 minimum wages, which is now a standard in coming on to a third of the country. And the final component is the idea for cities and regions to provide what you might call universal social goods. All right, so first up here is the maker movement. Now, I'm not sure how familiar any of you are with the idea of the maker movement, but the idea is pretty simple. I could right now go to Amazon.com and for $100 buy a 3D printer. A laser engraver, formerly refined, expensive manufacturing equipment, is now available via mail order, extremely cheap. This allows individuals to prototype quickly and develop new products without large research budgets. So you no longer need a manufacturing firm to finance the development of new products. Instead, makers are able to do it with their own ingenuity and a bit of simple equipment. These are some sample goods. These are custom printed 3D printed custom made shoes. This is high-end ketchup, which you will have trouble believing. This bottle of ketchup sells for $30 in the United States. This is a machine that makes pour-over coffee en masse for many people. It'll probably be popular here. This is a machine that 3D prints human organs for surgical practice. This is one where doctors would x-ray you. They would print a copy of your own organs so that they can practice for surgery. So social networking and advances in technology allow these individuals to run their own manufacturing businesses. And the maker movement, in fact, does many valuable things for US economies, or for economies globally. For one thing, it converts old forms of industrial knowledge into new consumer goods. So what you find in Chicago is that people who used to work in food processing become makers of new kinds of food, and so on and so forth. So it's a way of diversifying knowledge. Second, the maker movement combines different types of formal and informal knowledge. So it combines process knowledge, social knowledge, knowledge about markets, about consumers, and about people. Third, makers and their goods help to make places distinctive. Each place has kind of its own culture that becomes a draw to the human capital that cities all covet. A fourth advantage of the maker movement is that making supports local consumption, so people spend their money locally instead of leakage. In fact, it's effectively import substitution. And yet, despite all of this, very few maker businesses actually become large employers. Very few have any payroll at all. So our new challenge is this phenomenon of innovation that really works, that anybody can do, that provides all these benefits, and yet it doesn't provide the benefit of work, which is a bit of a problem for the way our economic development in the US has been configured. So most cities in the US are trying to support the maker movement, and yet they're providing support that makers don't need. So anywhere you go, this is a mobile van that's being built as a makerspace. It's a van with 3D printers in the back. All of our libraries in Chicago have 3D printers. Everybody is making workshops with 3D printers. That's not what people need. Makers face other problems. What do they actually need? Well, they need freedom from student loan debt because their student loan debt keeps them from capitalizing their own businesses. They need affordable production space, which is being crowded out by residential housing conversions in cities. They need access to capital, which they lack, and they need assistance in entering crowded consumer markets. So here's one challenge. The maker movement is strong in Seattle, as it is everywhere else. It does some things well for cities, and yet it doesn't provide subsistence, and it's a question how cities can support it. So this is kind of a first dilemma or issue or challenge that shows you kind of where the edge or the boundary, the frontier of economic development in the United States is. Okay, so on to the more controversial topic. I'm not here to endorse marijuana legalization, but most US states and voters are increasingly going that way. Just as the entire nation of Canada has copied the United States, I'm from the state of Colorado, which is kind of the first place to fully legalize, so I became interested in this topic. Several states have already done this. Many more are planning to do it this year, and it's not just through citizen votes, it's increasingly legislators and elected officials will vote for this. That's how much the idea has changed in the United States. Well, why? The first idea is that legalization creates a new source of tax revenue. In the US, we're very starved for sources of tax revenue. It contributes in other ways to local economies. It allows investment in research, technology, and production, in new machinery, in new types of products. But I want to focus attention on the third point. Decriminalizing the sale and consumption in the United States has led to what you might call a peace dividend, that our public budget for incarceration is declining because we're spending less money on it. And people who were formerly not contributing to the economy are now free legal citizens who are able to contribute their efforts to our economies. I can say, I don't want to talk too long. So there are some formal ways in which this industry looks like a lot of other industries, like local food industries. If something comes locally and people spend their money on it locally, that's effectively import substitution. The places that legalized early in the United States have developed all these advanced service industries, so specialized law firms, specialized crop insurance, specialized architecture, and so on. This was the ability, essentially, to create some new industries. And yet, the real advantage, and I apologize for the photos, I don't want you to mistake my interest in this. My interest in this is purely as a researcher. The greatest benefits to this, however, concern human development. Policing. So much of police work and police budgeting in the United States was spent on these offenses. Imprisoning these offenders costs far more than feeding or housing or doing other things for poor citizens. Mandatory sentencing laws in the United States have created tens of millions of people. I said millions, but it's tens of millions, with little potential to contribute to the economy because they are locked up for life. And what I want to note for you is just how things have changed in the United States. You now have people and economists saying, it really doesn't make sense. Here we are worried about sources of productivity growth in our economy, and we're spending billions of dollars to lock people up and make sure they don't contribute to the economy. This is the change in view in the United States through which you need to understand this change. Okay, I'm going to move on to the third topic, economic participation. So sticking with Seattle, which by the way was the second place in the United States to legalize, Seattle was the first city in the US to pass a $15 minimum wage. Why is this? Well, the first thing to know is that Amazon, Microsoft, and all these high technology industries and offshore investors only benefit a very small part of the population. The typical two-bedroom apartment, for example, in Seattle costs $2,000 a month. Just astronomical by our standards. At the current federal minimum wage, a worker would need to work 76 hours a month just to pay the rent, right? This is somebody who doesn't have to eat, who doesn't have to buy clothes, or go to the doctor or do anything else. Just to pay the rent, they would basically have to only work. Furthermore, restaurants, entertainment, and retail industries in Seattle employ far more people than does Amazon or Microsoft. So this is where the bulk of the population works, and they see Microsoft and Amazon driving up prices on real estate they can't afford. So what's interesting about the minimum wage is that economic thinking in the United States on this topic has changed as well. The old thinking was that the minimum wage is expensive. Wages are a cost of business, raise the cost of business and business suffers. And throughout the United States, we heard for so long that raising the minimum wage was bad for the economy. And yet the new thinking, this is one prominent book behind it, is remarkable. It just says, yes, high wages are a cost of business, but they're also a support for human beings. They result in more consumer spending, they result in more time on the job, higher productivity from workers, and from household stability. In the United States, the typical low-wage business goes through all of its workers every 6 months. Every time somebody gets sick, they have to quit their job. Anytime a child gets sick or a daycare provider gets sick, people have to quit their job. Economists increasingly recognize that this is inefficient and that the human case, the developmental and productivity case for raising the minimum wage outweighs the cost to business. Now let me give you one example quote. This is a representative economist from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. And I saw this guy at a conference in rural Virginia about a year ago. What he said was fairly striking. He said, the US economy is running out of sources of growth, and that economic growth depends on how many people are working and how productive they are. Future growth will require increasing our labor force, but there are large disparities between groups of people of prime working age across a variety of dimensions: education, race, gender, geography. So the insight here is that growing the labor force requires improving employment outcomes for these groups. And then in fact, this old-fashioned economist now sees investing in these people as the main way to drive the economy forward. And this is leading to kind of a fourth area where once again the city of Seattle, once one of the most old-fashioned extraction industry, is now kind of at the forefront. And that's what I'm going to call universal social goods. These programs follow the same logic as the change in thinking on the minimum wage in the United States. The old thinking, of course, was that public programs are inefficient, that public housing, welfare, and food assistance in the United States, and that funding higher education was an inefficient government reallocation of resources that the market could do better. The new thinking is that public programs ensure that everybody participates in the economy. That these programs generate the skills and knowledge that humans need. And I'm going to show you a rather remarkable number of examples of these things. This is a picture of one of Seattle's Housing First programs. In the United States, we used to give very complicated housing assistance. We wouldn't just house people who were homeless. We would give $200 of credit here, we would put them in subsidized housing. The new program is called Housing First, and the idea is to give people housing. This is something that was unthinkable in the United States, but in the human development framework makes sense. Another move is for free community college and free college. And I'm proud to include my own university, which at least for Illinois residents, now people under $60,000 pay no tuition. The cutback in state education meant that even poor people in the United States would be asked to pay $20,000 a year to go to university. This is something else that has changed. Free public wireless programs are taking off in the United States, again, under the logic that giving people internet access helps them be economically active. Food banks rather than food stamps, right? So give people food rather than give them some kind of subsidies for food. Universal child care is something which we do not have in the US and is now something that many cities, including Seattle, are investigating pilot programs for. Finally, too slow, the United States is moving towards universal elder care. Also on the recognition that families, that workers who spend time taking care of sick elders are less economically productive. Let's move on. So what I hope to have shown you here is simply that thinking and practice in US economic development are moving towards human development. That's the change in thinking that makes sense of all of these changes, which, by the way, 15 years ago, I could not have predicted any of this. I could not have predicted a minimum wage of $6 or legalization, or that individuals could be manufacturers, or that we would simply give people housing and food rather than making them go through a lot of complicated public programs. So these are real changes. So these represent a human development approach that's emerging in the country least likely, I think, historically to undertake it. And yet, of course, human development theory and thinking has its own problems. Amartya Sen left it deliberately open-ended, so it's not prescriptive. It simply says it's good to give people things that let them be self-sufficient. He does not address the questions of how or why or with what resources. It provides no criteria for prioritizing scarce developmental resources. So nobody can just, no country has enough wealth to simply invest in all of these things, so we need to think about how and which comes first. Human development theory is, of course, not sensitive to the particulars of place. The kinds of idioms and thinking and logic that work in the US would not transfer here or anywhere else, at least not in a literal way. Finally, human development theory is both normative, that is, it's values-laden, and it's descriptive. It tells us simultaneously about how the world should be and how it is, and sometimes it gets the two confused, which is a bit of a problem. Is that it? No, yes. And so what I want to say, again going to another picture of the Seattle waterfront, which is no longer choked with smog, is that we don't yet have a good way, nobody does, to explain these changes in the economy, where manufacturing is no longer the goal. But a good test for any explanation of the world as it is would be whether it can explain changes in Seattle, whether it can explain the transformation of this city from a provincial, relatively poor place to a wealthy global one. And it'd be whether it can prescribe useful practice for citizens. This theory, of course, would also have to look at the economy in context, which is why, while I'm happy to tell you about the US and let you know that it's not as you may think it is, I'm reluctant to try to engage in any kind of ideas for how these ideas would travel here, because each place is its own economy. And as much as anything, what we've seen in economic development in the US is the escape from grand models that purport to explain everything, everywhere, all the time, and towards ideas about development that are more situated, more place-specific, and more sensitive to the realities of social mores, of political institutions, of people and their desires. So thank you, and I hope you found this interesting.
Thank you, Mr. Marc, for the insight. Next to share with us about housing policy and the governance of neighborhood change, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Andrew Greenlee.
I'm sorry here, we're just dealing with technology. I'm inducing error into the systems. It shouldn't pop up anything, it should just once the presentation is just go into the presentation. All right, good morning, everyone. I would like to echo the thanks that Professor Doussard gave for all of you being here and for the invitation to come and speak today. It's a pleasure to be here. So in some ways, I think it's really fortuitous that Professor Doussard and I are having the opportunity to present together. Professor Doussard laid out, I think, a really compelling kind of overview of what's going on, particularly in terms of economic development. And I'm going to kind of pick up another side of some of these same issues, which is looking more specifically at some of the cases that Professor Doussard talked about with regards to housing and housing policy. In the US, our housing policy has focused largely on dealing with issues at either the very bottom of the market, the people who can least afford housing and who are most exposed to issues of housing instability and housing quality challenges, or the people at the top, the people who with very little incentive can afford, consume housing, in many cases multiple homes. And so another piece of that policy is very much focused on incentivizing consumption, in fact overconsumption of housing in many cases, by the wealthy. And so what I want to do today is to use the case of Chicago and to provide several different instances and readings of housing policy and its evolution and history in Chicago to kind of understand where it is that we're likely going moving forward in the future and what some of the challenges are that we face, particularly governing housing and the related social and economic issues that are related to it. Right, so one way to look at this in Chicago and many other cities is actually pretty simple. So we can kind of turn to a Dickensian quote or a Dickensian reading, right, of the situation. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And these things exist very conspicuously in contrast to each other in the same types of spaces. And when I describe this, and I describe Chicago, Chicago is both unique in some ways, but also really quintessentially American and expresses some of the quintessential social and economic formations and challenges that we see throughout many U.S. cities, but it's also unique in some ways. Chicago has interestingly become what I would describe as a federal housing policy laboratory. It's a place where a lot of the federal government's policies are implemented first, in many cases in experimental forms, and then promulgated following the results, or sometimes even before the end of the results of those experiments, to other cities and regions throughout the nation. So I think this is important to keep in mind as I kind of delve into a bit more detail Chicago, that many of the same types of social and economic formations, many of the same governance challenges are also well reflected within other cities throughout the nation. Right, so again, I would describe us as having kind of a Dickensian setup, right? In certain portions of the city and the region, there is unbelievable prosperity, wealth, and fortune, and that's only continuing to grow, particularly with some of the changes that Professor Doussard has already described. But then at the same time, for people who are not able to access that type of winning and that type of wealth, there are extreme challenges that have now for many generations, in fact, only gotten worse and only gotten more acute. All right, so let's just kind of take a look at how this is kind of mirrored and reflected. As we move, and as Professor Doussard described, as we move towards consumption-based economy, things like restaurant rankings actually become really important things for cities to kind of reflect upon how they're doing. And Chicago is winning in many cases, and with regards to culinary innovation. Right? So within a consumption-based economy, a major indicator. What we see, particularly in certain housing markets in the city, is that they've never been better. We're seeing unprecedented high levels of rent and unprecedented demand for some of real estate in certain areas, particularly within the city core. And this is a boom of a type that we haven't really seen before and are trying to contend with, particularly as it relates to, well, what happens to people who are unable to afford that. But it's important to note that in Chicago, around 50% of residents actually pay more than what we consider an affordable share of their income towards rent. And typically, right now, it's around a third of residents pay more than half of their income towards rent. So this is a big issue. we like to see the signs of the market doing well, and we'd like to see the signs of these unprecedented high numbers. But the question that comes up is, well, where are not just poor people going to be able to live, but where are also middle class, middle income people going to be able to live in a city where these unprecedented highs are not matched with changes in people's economic status or salary. We see also hot warehouse markets, and some of this goes back again to the type of innovation that we've already heard about today. That is, in fact, a major reduction in industrial vacancy. We already heard that this is causing problems, particularly for small startups who need that space in order to be able to innovate and grow. So again, some people would say that's a sign of winning, right, in terms of that demand being present and being there. But at the same time, right, we have the worst of times that we have to think about. We have interventions that have tried to, for instance, capture some of the benefit that's going on within the hot portions or hot real estate markets in the city, and to transfer some of that benefit into shoring up and creating new markets within adjacent and surrounding areas. Right? These policies are designed basically to make sure that we don't increase the level of unevenness that already exists. And what we're seeing, in fact, is that those policies aren't getting the job done. While they are collecting revenue from, that is basically from the benefit of new development, we're seeing that developers are actually not going ahead and using that revenue that's sitting in these pots of money that the city has in order to develop the affordable housing that is supposed to be developed as a result of the massive increase. Right? So we see developers that are chasing after the market rate things, but even with the types of subsidies that the cities are creating in order to shore up the affordable end of the market, developers are saying, why bother building that? Let someone else do that. So unlike Seattle, that has been able to be a bit more progressive in this regard, even as cities like Chicago attempt to make sure that inclusionary housing is happening, there are major challenges to actually realizing that and seeing it happen in practice. Chicago is now, ironically, also a shrinking city. The important fact here, in fact, is not necessarily the population loss itself, but rather it is who is leaving the city. 90% of the households that left Chicago between 2000 and 2010 were African American. And most of these are households with young children, right? So we have to ask ourselves, why in particular is there this major kind of push factor out of the city for the African American population? Well, I'm going to explain a little bit of that as we go on, but this is an important thing for us to understand. At the same time, another major issue is that the level of international migration that has historically buoyed the population of the city has not been realized at the same rate that it has in the past. There's still a very strong flow of international migrants to Chicago. It's still considered a very important gateway city in the country. However, those numbers are not keeping up the ways that they have in the past, particularly as many of these other cities that have really invested heavily in quality of life now are far more attractive to move to. And so this kind of leads us to this paradoxical situation where we can have these two headlines literally put next to each other if you go on the internet and read the news. In one neighborhood, we have over a weekend 9 people shot dead, another 45 wounded. And then paradoxically, in another neighborhood, we have residents whose biggest complaint is that the gelateria in their neighborhood is not producing high enough quality gelato for them to consume. And so they are going and starting to have political action to get a better brand of gelato in their gelato store. That is kind of the paradox that we see in the city right now in terms of the quality of life differentials in neighborhoods that are in fact not very far apart from each other. And so a lot of people have tried to describe this divide. They've described this in a lot of different ways, but I think the Tale of Two Cities metaphor really does help us to capture some piece of it. It's important to note that while housing is one of the main organizing frameworks that supports this division, there's also many other things. There are things like schools and school policy that become important. And as well, there's things like economic development policy and job supports that become really important as well. And so we see this differential increase across many different forms of governance. What I'm going to do today is spend time talking specifically about housing and how these issues are manifest there. I think it's important to note, right, that these are not new issues. This is not an emergent issue in Chicago. This is part of a long-term story and a long-term trend. All right, so to illustrate the level of difference that we're talking about, this is a map of racial segregation in the city. And so we can see, right, the dots on the map represent populations by race. And so we can see there's basically a white portion of the city. There are several black portions of the city. There are several Latino portions of the city. There's a small Asian portion of the city here. But to a large extent, these are really separate and unequal spaces in many cases in the city. The level of racial segregation, in fact, the needle has not really moved. Right? The city has become slightly more racially integrated, but for the most part, the pattern that we saw of racial separation in 1960 is really the same pattern that we see today, as are the differentials in terms of income by race, are really very similar as they were in the 1960s. If we look at income, it's the same thing. Right? We have areas of relative affluence and wealth that are highly separated from areas of more concentrated poverty and disadvantage. And as you might imagine, if you overlay this with race, you see that there is very much a correlation between those two things. And so again, we see that these numbers have not moved very much either. All right, it is, there we go. And so I think it's important to contextualize this, right? This is not just an issue, again, of Chicago. This is an issue of many cities within the state. Just in January of this year, Governing Magazine did a major expose on segregation throughout the state of Illinois. And here are dissimilarity numbers, so we can see the level of black-white residential segregation. Right, a number of 75 here, or 0.75, means that in this case, 75% of African American households would have to move within Chicago to become evenly integrated with the white population in the city. Compared, if we look at metro areas throughout the country, of around 52%. So where we are in Champaign, Urbana is actually doing pretty well. It's at 49% or 0.49. But it gives you a relevance of what, when we saw that segregation map, of what this looks like in practice. And the interesting thing here is that this translates over into lifelong advantage and disadvantage for residents. Right, so we have paradoxically here, based upon research done by Raj Chetty, information that shows that in fact the longer a child is exposed to living within Cook County, Illinois, which is, this is the county that Chicago is located in, the second largest county in the nation, right, they actually end up having a lower probability of having an increase in income in their lives. And right next door to it is DuPage County, which is one of the most wealthy counties in the nation. And in fact, we see that exposure effect there actually, no surprise, increases the likelihood that a child is going to have a higher income over time. Right, so these have the geography of residence, where people live, really does comport to major material differences in the benefits that they have. And so this gives us a framework for describing an awful divide within the city. Right? One that is both about race and income, that is intimately linked to the governance of housing. And so that leads us to the question of, well, what role has the government had in supporting or creating this type of divide that we see, and more importantly, what role has it had in the persistence of this divide over time? So a few kind of things that we want to pay attention to from the history of our housing governance strategies in the US. Our national housing policy really formed in the 1930s and 1940s in the wake of the last major housing crisis, the Great Depression, and resulting housing market crash throughout the nation. And so the real goal of that policy was to focus on standardizing access to homeownership, capital, particularly for low and middle class white communities and people. Ironically, these policies at the same time, in fact, explicitly outlawed or denied equal access to those same types of resources to non-white communities. And so this type of a capital imbalance is still felt today. While those laws are no longer legal, and those the precedents that were set actually continue to reverberate throughout the ways in which people access capital and the extent to which they are able to get loans at a reasonable price. Right, I have to implicate at the same time folks like me, folks within urban planning. Planners, particularly at the same time period, use as a major rationale for zoning, right, the preservation of neighborhood class and racial stability. Right? So we talked about things like creating harmonious land use mixes. Right? But what harmonious meant was that groups were separated from each other and therefore harmony was achieved. I have to point out in particular some of the early founding members of our department, our department's early laundry, were really central in promoting this type of a racialized approach to harmonization by race, ethnicity, and class within housing policy. And then finally, in the 1950s and 1960s, the major problems of the industrial city were addressed through strategies of urban renewal. And those strategies focus on the demolition and modernization of slum settlements and communities. But what happened was that the politics associated with that modernization resulted in the further segmentation and separation of populations by race and income. So in some ways, we could describe this as a form of American-style housing apartheid. Right? And this really connects back to, in fact, national studies and national policy that shows how systematically these things happen in cities throughout the US. Right? So we see, for instance, that cost burden for households, right? The cost differentials, right, from the 1960s to present remain a major issue that separates households. We see that bias within real estate markets likewise continues to separate people. And we know that people of color in particular are, regardless of their income, are not shown the same housing opportunities and same units as people who are not of color. This has been a really important year for focusing on market actors like landlords in the US. We spent a lot of time talking about how landlords are important gatekeepers to housing issues in the US. And finally, we know that we have a much bigger problem, which is that there is simply not a sufficient supply of affordable housing to meet the needs of the population, regardless of dealing with the issue of where it might be located. So we end up basically having two societies, right, that are largely defined through housing policy. One for the middle class, particularly privately developed housing, for sale and single family, and one for the poor that is publicly owned and frequently is multifamily. Right, so thinking specifically about housing policy, right, how is this being reproduced over time? Right, back at this time where I was talking about where we had the zoning, the promulgation of housing policy, we also had the Euro segregation, right? By law, households are being separated by race. That leads to de facto segregation. Segregation that's happening basically by the thrust of social forces. So this is what this looks like in Chicago. If we look at the neighborhood change and neighborhood racial composition from 1910 to 1920 to 1930, right? This is not a coincidence, right? The area where non-whites can live is a matter of de jure segregation, areas where it was legally allowed, and also de facto segregation. And so here is what de facto segregation looks like. This is a map of riots and violence with the spaces where African Americans could live described around it. So containment was literally achieved through physical force, by continually beating people back into one particular space where it was acceptable for them to live. Next up, our policy focused on transforming neighborhoods that might have looked something like this, slum settlements, into something that looked a little bit more like this. That would be social housing. And that moves us into the moment of the second ghetto. I might actually need you to advance for me. It's does not work. So next slide. So we have at mid-century and as part of the post-war reconstruction package, right, a rationale really that focused on building housing as an economic development strategy. Right, so again, here's where our work intersects. Right, so the 1949 Housing Act both authorizes urban renewal and also authorizes mass suburbanization and construction of homes, not just for the benefit of people that were coming back from the war, but also for the benefit of priming the economic pump in the U.S. using home building as a major strategy. Next slide, please. We see this actually described really well within a cartoon, within Superman. This is described as a super heroic feat in the U.S. Right? So we have slum communities that are disordered. Next slide. And we literally have an account of Superman coming in, demolishing those slums. Next slide. And in its place, next slide, building up new federally supported public housing to replace and modernize those communities. So literally captured within the public record of our cartoons, right, is the story of the transformation of these neighborhoods. And so this looks like this in terms of that map of race. And just kind of go through these. So we end up with a city that at this point is still basically black and white, right? For the most part. So what do things look like now? How are we governing these situations right now? Well, and so this is kind of a question I want to provide just a little bit more evidence of, and then provide some concluding thoughts. Right, how can a city like Chicago maintain the types of disparities that we've seen through these kind of historical formations at a time when the project is one of breaking down those disparities and dealing head on with those problems? So let's first get a little reconnaissance from our race map. Just look through those, 1990, 2010. So now we have a city that's about a third African American, a third white, and a third Latino, with Latino population emerging really since the 1960s and 1970s. At the federal level, the discourse is exactly the same regarding the issue of concentrated poverty and disadvantage that we saw throughout the historical period. On the very low-income side of things, I'm going to talk about the low-income side and then households more generally. On the low-income side of things, Chicago continues to serve as a federal policy laboratory. And that policy laboratory has focused on the demolition of the types of public housing we built at mid-century and inserting market-based public-private partnerships in their place, as opposed to just solely publicly owned public housing. So we see in the transformation of that housing this goal of what they say is really re-knitting together the social, economic, and physical fabric of the city through the physical transformation of the housing itself. Delivering the benefits of that change now through public-private partnerships instead of through solely public dollars, and also through mixed finance and development. And so it looks like this. It looks like a few forms in the city. There's still some physical public housing units. There's some mixed income housing, which are new housing developments that incorporate both low-income tenants with subsidies and also market-rate tenants. And then there's another program that focuses on subsidizing low-income households living on the private market. Right? Some people say that this is change in progress, but some people also argue, in fact, this is through a guerrilla marketing campaign, that this is in fact a form of chaos, and in fact is not progress at all. Right? And we see this reflected within the voices and words of public housing residents who feel, in fact, that they're being displaced from historic communities that they lived in and pushed out and pushed into neighborhoods that they don't want to otherwise be in. And so we see this in multiple places, whether that housing is being transformed into mixed income housing or whether that housing is facing pressure to be redeveloped as market rate housing. And so here, in fact, is what that pushing out looks like. I'm just pulling from some of, I'm going to pull from a few of my research papers here. This is following the demolition of that Greenlee green development where that person was talking about. Here's the geography of residents within the city itself and a piece of the region for residents. In fact, what we see is that in many cases, residents actually end up moving into areas where they're slightly worse off demographically. We see some of the same things for those residents of Lathrop homes. We see actually they're living in areas where income is in fact lower and rents are higher. So now being exposed to the market, they're actually being buffeted and faced with worse issues than they face within public housing itself. And so we have this kind of paradox of a dual mandate, right? One that is to further integrate the market into public and subsidized housing provision and to use state-driven processes to create social and economic uplift that benefits households. But we see, in fact, that the protections that were designed to protect households from what we might call the quote-unquote dangers of the market just simply haven't worked and haven't provided that protection that households are looking for. We see, in fact, disintegration as opposed to integration, somewhat argued by design within the policies themselves. And then furthermore, we see that as the market is kind of further inserted into processes of providing the public good here, we end up with challenges as certain areas of the city are growing and others are shrinking. That in many cases there's not actually the market activity that's sufficient enough to actually support the construction of the public good, the public housing itself. So another paradox we face is that. So I want to provide just a little bit of evidence also from the private market and folks outside of that public realm. And so I want to do this by looking at how people are moving throughout the city itself in terms of their residential moves. This is what that looks like. This is a constellation of moves in between neighborhoods. You're looking at around 16 million moves conducted by around 6 million households over the last decade in Chicago. Slide. Here's that if we look at the relationship between the origins and destinations that people move to and from and how they cluster together. Right? And so this is interesting to me as a social researcher who knows Chicago quite well. I can look at this and tell you what the story is, but of course I'm going to tell you right now. All right, what if we put that map next to the map of race? Right, a big piece of our housing policy has focused on allowing people to choose their housing and opening up housing choice. But what we see, even looking at the choices of households who have more choice than the types of low-income households we're talking about, is that those moves continue to be clustered and segmented by race and income, right? Even looking at the general population. Right? And so another way to look at this is to say, well, race and income describe this, but how about the kind of mix of opportunities that are available? Are households that are low income able to move up, right? Even if they're moving within areas that might be racially or economically homogenous. And so what we see, in fact, is that there's still major challenges here. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of who moves, we see that young people tend to move, higher income people tend to move, those that are living in higher opportunity neighborhoods in the first place tend to move. We also see, however, that those seeking to escape the lowest income neighborhoods tend to move at a higher rate than on average, and those seeking to escape racially concentrated poverty. We see that, on the other hand, that owners, households in single-family units, and married households tend to move less frequently, which would be expected. What we see, and this is looking at moves up and down, the kind of hierarchy of neighborhoods within the region, is that there's more churning that's happening both in the most opportune areas and the people with the most opportunity, and amongst those that are in fact at the bottom here and face the least opportunity. A positive sign is that the greatest share of upward moves are in fact from the people that live in the most disadvantaged areas. And so that says maybe we're doing something right with regards to those households. We also see that households are trading off different things as they're making their moves. We see some households trading off things like centrality and transit access for other opportunities. We see some people trading off things like transit access and decentralizing, moving out into suburban spaces. We see some people that focus in particular on making improvements to schools and other things that are governed hyper-locally. And then we see some people that are moving with regards to jobs. Almost done. So what does this all tell us? Right? We see that these patterns reveal potential for some households to move up within the region, but this remains largely still dependent upon race and class. Right, so our governance strategies, as they've evolved over time, as they've tried to become more sensitive to both market conditions and to the barriers that households face, right, they still have not been able to really surmount the issues of race and class and existence within the region. We see evidence of a considerable amount of churning, particularly for those households at the top and the bottom of that mobility spectrum, and particularly those households who were start off in racially segregated neighborhoods. We also see that origin neighborhoods are highly determinative of your destination. So this again speaks to the challenge for some households of being able to move up and to move to more favorable places. And we consider to see the extreme importance of race and income in underscoring the issues that we face in the city. So I'm actually going to stop there so that we have plenty of time for questions. I'd like to say thank you again, Terima kasih, for the opportunity to be here and to share some of what's going on in Chicago.
Thank you so much, Mr. Greenlee, for the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, now that we have come to the final session of the lecture, we are now pleased to open the floor for the Q&A session. So if there are any of the audiences who want to ask questions regarding the previous presentations, please raise your hand.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions. One, is there in the slum or squatters in Illionis town or other cities? How to deal with it? Urban cases from the side of economic development and housing policy, especially from land acquisition. Okay. Number two, whether in Illinois or other city in USA, Seattle or Chicago, internet or mobile phone affect development economic and also neighborhood, housing, moving or trading. Okay, thank you.
Sure, well I can certainly answer the first question, the question of squatters. This was a particular issue in public housing in the 1990s. Many of the units were actually not being occupied by the residents who were supposed to be living in them. Those people had moved out and were actually renting those units to people who were either squatting or who did not belong there. Right now, we do have a substantial homeless issue. Over the past, really it's only been the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen a decline in homelessness, and it's been the past 2 or 3 years that we've seen an uptick again in homelessness. Many cities throughout the U.S., in fact including the cities that we live in, Champaign and Urbana, have been very aggressive about removing squatters and very aggressive about removing, we've had a lot of people that end up setting up tent camps or tent cities. We did have one in Champaign, I think as recently as 2011 when I moved there. Cities have worked very hard to eliminate those, but the challenge there is that there has not necessarily been a robust strategy for dealing with the reasons why people are squatting in the first place, or the reasons why people are living in tent cities in the first place. We see in cities that are really focused on quality of life issues, like Seattle, focus on these models like housing first, but there's many other cities that have not yet, don't have the resources or who have not yet taken up similar strategies. So rather, it seems to me that the strategy is more about simply making it uncomfortable and pushing those folks out rather than helping them and providing services in place. And part of the challenge here is one of fiscal austerity. Local governments are being asked to do more with less, and while they would like to deal with the issue, there's simply insufficient resources to be able to do so. But I'll let you want to take the second question?
I will try the second question. It is a very good question. It's also extremely difficult. So well done by you. I think obviously the internet and handhelds are affecting development in all kinds of ways. I think you can just focus on 3 examples among many. The first is there's evidence that the physical character and infrastructure of neighborhoods is being altered because people are now building to suit phones. And I'll give you an example. Many restaurants in the United States now and globally are designed in order to be photographable. So you design your food to have bright images, a clear menu, and everything else, right? So you have the actual development of service industries in anticipation of how they will circulate on social media. A small example, but I think it's a relevant one. Second example, we have a lot of, it might seem difficult to believe, we have a lot of data poverty problems in the US, by which I mean we have a lot of issues for which we have very poor data. Smartphones have become a means of organizing for people who are trying to come up with data that don't exist from our census data. For example, people have used smartphones to collect data on negligent landlords, and workers have used these phones to collect data on flexible work schedules, which we don't have in the census, but which really complicate people's family obligations. A third simple example is that the maker economy that I talked about, it exists through the internet. That's how you find a manufacturer in the Pearl River Delta. It's how you find customers. It's how you do literally everything, right? So the entire condition of possibility for people to start their own manufacturing businesses is being able to get to scale through the internet. When you used to need the resources of a firm to develop markets and so on, now you don't need those resources. That's an enormous question, and my answer cannot be close to satisfactory, but thank you for asking.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Professor Marc and Professor Andrew and Mr. Sa. Prima, I would like to thank you. It is very good for me to be here to hear your presentation, but I have to introduce myself first. I may be the youngest here. I'm 18. I pretend to be 18. Okay. And I have participated in development of metallurgy and material. 2 departments. The other department is chemical department. So I was obligated to develop this further. So if I hear from you, Professor Marc, you are telling about cities in America, and they develop each of them different character, industry. But at the same time, you are also involved in human development because it's connected together. And so my question is, how do you start with it? Is it just naturally they build, cities built themselves and have a certain trend, or is by the government being selected
So I think the answer has 2 parts. Cities in the U.S. are not centrally planned. The example of urban renewal that Professor Andrew gave, when cities bulldozed, tore down slums, that's about the most coordinated central planning U.S. cities have had. U.S. cities have famously been developed by the private market. To give you another example, Chicago was built in a swamp. It was a terrible place to build a city. And yet it became a large city because the private individuals who founded it used a bunch of deceptive advertising to get people to move there. So that's been the historical development of US cities. Human development, I think, has happened independently, and I would argue it's happening intellectually. So it's really the idea, economists have a lot of influence in US public policy. There's been a real change in kind of orthodox economics to value human development criteria. And that's kind of the source of the change. Now, some of this is a response to social movements, right? The $15 minimum wage happened because of a social movement. And yet, it's the intellectual understanding of human development that has made that, helped economists to make sense of it. And it's helped cities to understand and accept this as a useful thing. So I think it's two separate issues, but there's no central planning of cities in the U.S., not in any kind of way that would be familiar.
Okay, so the next question is, because university, our university, we have joined with another university, and to develop a certain area, we call it Sukabumi. And now the question is, how shall we do it? My question is, from Jakarta to Sukabumi, they are building the infrastructure. And now it is within 1 hour we are in Sukabumi. But Sukabumi area itself, so I'm not talking about the whole Indonesia, just part of Indonesia. How to develop this part, Sukabumi, into development, well-controlled development. So we should have a master plan. So if I look at the basic, what are we doing? We have to progress this. We must be making the people happy, okay? But it's different, and any people have different way of be happy. So I would say always the first thing is you must have good food, have meal, you can have good sleep, okay? And you must have for the health, must be well, control. And then for the education is there, and also for transport if you want to go somewhere. And the last one is sometimes vacation, we have to go vacation, so must have fun. So I said that is most of the principal part of human to be prosperous, yes. So because we have a plan, University of Indonesia, university, three universities. One is local in Sukabumi, and they are intended to develop this area, So maybe you can give some advice how to do it. Because if this toll road is finished, I think about 2020. So what will be happen with this area? If we don't have master plan, then it's maybe like America. So each develop something, and then there is no what you call it, correlation between one and the other. So we would like to make it with a plan, master plan. So can you give a proposal how to do it? How to? We have to make a study. Is it for industry, agriculture, or something like that? Can you give some advice for this? And of course, including housing. In Jakarta, we start already housing. So people from the slum will move and going to town, so far.
I'm going to say two simple things and pass the mic. The first is that plans never work how you think they're going to work, which is a general rule for all plans. And having a process that recognizes that the plan is a guideline, but that it doesn't become reality and that the world changes while you're doing it is crucial. The second point, pretty simply, is a lot of the things you're talking about in terms of well-being have to do with national policy, social norms, and other things, and to make them the job of an individual spatial or site plan about linking two cities is to take on too much. And often the things you can affect with that kind of plan pale next to making sure that people have healthcare and well-being, just like you said. So I think it's very important to separate the national from the national and even the global questions from the local ones. And I think too often local plans are not sensitive to the fact that they depend on decisions made elsewhere. And I think that's kind of a first, as much as I know anything, that's a first rule about understanding those plans.
Yeah, not much to add. I think that's exactly right. I think another part of the issue that is kind of a cautionary tale from the American side of things, and the reasons why our plans tend to diverge greatly, is that they tend to be reactive in nature rather than kind of proactive and looking ahead. And so I think there's an opportunity, particularly as we're at a gathering and talking more about smart cities, to think about how we can create better points of reflection and feedback and understanding about what that happiness looks like, how those things are playing out as development is occurring a little bit closer to real time, rather than once we have kind of secondary and tertiary problems that are emerging that then we have to kind of deviate from our initial strategy to deal with. So I think there's a real opportunity there. That's certainly something that we've been looking at trying to do more of in the U.S. I think as Marc said, there's still the challenge of we're very data rich in some areas, but lack a lot of the data that would help us to understand at the front line where individuals are facing challenges or where our interventions are not meeting their expectations or their needs. So I think that's really another area that I think there's some lessons learned that we could hopefully help bring into plans here.
I feel very sad. Yeah, because you said so there's no planning necessary because it will be jeopardized by other occasions. And what I mean is if the government, local government also involved, and they said, okay, we guarantee you that this planning has to be worked. But before we do that, we have to do surveys, a survey. So I don't like to see that everybody's going there, firstly the investor, and then they grow up there and there is no, look, we have population there, okay? So I look at the statistic. Certain area, there are more old people as young people. And in fact, the young people should work for the old people. So that area should be developed. How, for example, we establish there an industry. So that the other young people coming there, so we call it cluster. We try to do the cluster. So to invite them. But if we said, okay, give it to everybody. Yeah, investor, they are interested in cheap labor, yeah, but no education. So we have to see if a country, the population is not educated well, that's not good. I take an example in my home. I bought a house there. It was a resident house. They call it very nice. But what happened now? There are so many shops, restaurants in this area. So the planning, the first planning was not being followed. Why? Because the government, the local government is not being involved in this. So I try to do another thing by involving the army, the police, the army also, they will have the facility there. But with the condition they have to take care that the planning is secure. They should follow the, maybe that's one of the solutions, but we have to do that. Otherwise, what you said, so leave it to what it is. That is not good. it will be a chaos. And then we have again the problem with poor and rich people. And this is what we should not do there. So if we are a government, is the first function of a government is how to prosper the people. Like you have no problem for the slum area and so on. So we would like to start so that no slum area will be created by just, investor and so on, private investor. So we have to do the planning. But I'm sure, I agree with you that it's not easy. But I try to, the government and also the university, because the university there are a lot of people, thinkers, not the farmers and so on. So they have to look for a way how to do. So I think if smart city can assist us, so that the assistant how to do it. So I have to talk with Mr. Prima because he's the important person now. So I think maybe we should contact more also. I will tell you more about our problems. Maybe we find a solution because I don't want it to be a wild west, This is a new country, and we try to do our best how to organize this new country into the way we would like to free people. But I thank you, Henry. So now I understand what smart city is. Mr. Prima. Thank you too. That's what I said. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. I hope I got over 50% of what you presented. But it was very interesting, especially that any plan, any policy you do, actually the outcome is very, unpredictable, especially technology, internet and so on. But in Indonesia we cannot do without planning because of our risk area, disaster risk and so on. There are places where you can build, there are places you cannot build, and planning becomes a commitment. Planning is not just a collection of statements to be implemented. It's a commitment between all parties, and in Indonesia you have the so-called Enginering, where planning starts from the village, goes to the sub-district, district, and so on. So it's a whole commitment, yearly review. So we hope actually that this kind of planning actually, although it changes, it also changes with developments in the field. I would like to ask you whether the human development indicators of the UN, can they be considered as a more stable or more absolute kind of measure where you can direct your decisions to? That's my first question. Maybe just one other.
Well, very quickly, I tried to address this towards the end. The human development indicators are limited, and their job is to motivate action, right? Their job is to allow people to trace how things are going. But what the human development indicators don't do is tell you how to improve people's lives. They tell you whether it's happening, right? So, like you say, the human development indicators tell us some things, but I think they fit with a view of planning that focuses on process. So you provided the example of planning starting in the village and moving up to bigger units. In human development terms, that's beneficial because it gets people involved in their lives, in their world. It gets people involved with self-expression. It engages people in understanding the world about them. It's good for a democracy. So those two views are very similar, which is maybe all that I can say, right? There's no indicator, and there's no plan, or there's no process that has the magic recipe for how to produce happiness and stability, because if somebody had developed that plan, we would have heard about it by now. And I hope that was a satisfactory answer. It's a very good question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Amira. It's actually more of a curiosity of my part when I saw the maps from Professor Andrew, the maps regarding the incomes and the health and the income and the race. It seems that in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, it seems like it's like a piece of cake that you kind of caught into, because I haven't been there. And I'm really curious about what happened between the meeting of each piece of cakes. So between there's an area that there's more of an African American, and then there's the Latino part, for example. The mix in the area in between, does it actually offer like an insight to be able to give some feedbacks to the policy for them to be able to create some more inclusive kind of neighborhood change. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. I think we have to kind of look at this in a few ways. There's a historical piece, and there's quite a lot of sociology that has used Chicago to kind of explain the kind of spatial relationships there, using everything from points of immigration. A lot of the kind of central focus of that pie near the downtown core was initially where a lot of industry was, and so then you had these kind of social groups that are kind of occupying an area that relates back to that core. Other theorists have actually even used things like prevailing winds to explain it. So where smoke would blow would be less advantageous space to live in, and would therefore be where lower income or more socially marginalized groups would live. These have all been kind of ways to explain the wedges to that pie. When you look at it, there's some physical features there that also make a difference. There's two branches of a river and a canal that form major physical boundaries there. More recently, there's also highway infrastructure that played a major role in carving up those pieces that you see of that pie. And so a lot of that happened at the same time as urban renewal, and while it was not the deliberation around it wasn't necessarily explicitly we're trying to carve these pieces of pie out, but what you see is that the political resistance or negotiation actually reflects where those fault lines and boundaries are. So we see things being built in areas of least resistance, and kind of then used as a strategy to contain or to separate people as well. So that's been part of the challenge. As the city is kind of spatially restructuring, particularly over the last 20 years, there's, rather than suburbanization and households moving out, there's been a lot of focus, particularly on higher income households moving back in. And so that's also greatly kind of influenced that pie, but as you saw on the maps there, it's really focused in particular areas where the higher income people are going. So they're still occupying a few small wedges and pockets of the pie that were dictated more by those historical patterns.
So in a sense that if you actually try to layer the race and then the neighborhood maps with the other kind of a maps, it might not look like those kind of parts.
It would look very similar, right? And part of the big challenge of the work that we do in Chicago, particularly if you're doing anything quantitative, is the just overwhelming significance of race and income as a beginning point for explaining the social, economic, and economic formations in the city. It's really fairly astounding and overwhelming.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Maybe continuing that question, I was wondering whether a different mixture of income and race would create a different response by developers, because developers, like in Indonesia, they try to find the highest income level, and when the whites are getting also higher income, so that leads to that segregation. If it would be different, the whites would have lower income. Could it have a different effect? I was thinking of developers as an important decision maker in the forming of settlements. Another question is about the spatial distribution of the housing. I didn't see how it was located, how it was related to the development of job centers, where people are moving toward jobs. Does it have a tendency of low-income workers getting closer to the industries, or maybe if it is different kind of industry, like high capital intensive industry, maybe some other groups are coming there. And third one, the last one, is about the willingness, what do you call it, keinginan untuk tinggal. You have a term for that. The willingness, the aspirations to find housing, is it related also to investment priorities? People think house is an asset that they can put as collateral and so on. Is there a indication, a phenomenon like that? Maybe just that.
All right, wow, that's a lot. We may do some passing back and forth of the microphone here. Do a little tag team, especially on the second question there. I'll start with the question about income mixes. This is something that really became a central piece of the local and federal strategy in the 1990s and 2000s. The concern that having kind of income homogeneous housing was creating both economic challenges and also was politically dangerous in many ways. And so a lot of the policy focused on developing around mixes of incomes. And so some of the housing that I showed you there in Cabrini Green, for instance, the idea was that you would have around a third very low income households, a third lightly subsidized kind of moderate income households, and then a third of households that were, for the most part, homeowners who were paying the market, paying whatever the market would bear. And that worked in some areas. It worked in areas where there was already strong demand and there were strong markets. But the challenge was that in many other areas where the city was developing this mixed income housing, there in fact simply wasn't a market to support the higher, there wasn't demand from higher income households to move into those spaces. And so the housing actually either never got built or simply hasn't been built at the pace that it needed to be because there wasn't demand for the market rate housing, which would then cross-subsidize and help pay for the social housing units. So what's happened more recently, particularly in Chicago, has been that developers are renegotiating what that mix looks like with the city government. and negotiating for more market rate units and fewer public and subsidized housing units. And so the challenge there is still that we have this policy that is designed to deliver these public and subsidized units, but developers have given the feedback that it's not going to work based upon their bottom line. But the challenge is then how do we actually deliver those units that there's an acute need for, while also working and partnering with developers. So we're seeing these mixes of incomes and playing around with what those mixes look like. But the bottom line is that the main issue is that the households who we say we're building these units for, which are the low-income households we want to support, are being negotiated out of the benefits of the housing development that's occurring. So this is a continued challenge. We want to develop the housing, but we have a moving target that we're dealing with here. So this just continues to be a major challenge. The housing distribution piece, I think this is an area where Marc can also speak to quite a bit. Just as many households had incentive to suburbanize from the 50s to the 2000s, or even to present, many jobs, including a lot of the industrial activity, also decentralized, given cheaper transport, better infrastructure, and things like that. I think there's been a mix of what's happened. There's still, I think this is quintessential spatial mismatch, where you have poor people now still predominantly living within the central portions of cities and now commuting further and further distance out to where those entry-level or lower-skilled jobs are. There's the larger issue that the types of decent-paying industrial jobs that would have supported households in the central city now simply don't exist anymore, which is a major issue. We're also starting to see some an increasing trend of suburbanization of poverty. So we are seeing lower income households moving out of the city, but it's not necessarily in response to being closer to jobs. So we're trying to figure all this out. A lot of it is more about the housing market dynamics and affordability. I guess we're lucky in that we have a relatively robust public transit and commuting infrastructure, but that fact notwithstanding, we do see that for many households, the amount of time they're spending either in cars or the amount of time that they're spending on public transit for low-income households is increasing as jobs are moving further out. We're also seeing the challenge, as we point to, in some cases, suburban spaces and say, well, this should actually be, this is a place where good schools are and the types of things that could help a low-income household get ahead. We're seeing that if they can't actually afford a car to live in some of those areas, that it's completely an inviolable option. You just simply can't make it work and can't meet your household needs. And so that also is a big challenge there. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that discussion?
I think there's two simple things I hopefully can add. In terms of population mixing and development, increasingly we understand that segregation, racial segregation, that development follows public investment. That the public sector's investment in parks, in streets, in roads, in services makes certain sites good targets for development. And essentially we now understand that racially sorting people where they live makes it very easy for the public sector to give all the services over here, but not over here. And that influences development because then the public sector support for development becomes very spatially targeted and specific and easy for the developers to identify. The second point, it's very much like what Professor Andrews said. As manufacturing jobs have left U.S. cities, their downtowns, the central business districts, have become entertainment districts. These are where the low-wage jobs are. but that's also where the high-cost housing is. So the amount of time that the poor commute is rising because they are the only housing they can afford is at the edge of the city or in the suburbs. But the low-wage jobs are still downtown. So this creates a burden for commuting, and it's why this question of work schedules is so important, because a lot of people travel 2 hours to work, and if when they show up their boss says no work today, this becomes a real problem. I'll leave it at that, but definitely the poor are being asked to go further for lousier jobs. It's not healthy for a society.
May I complete this question?
Yes.
Because the question is, your government, whether your government or private sector are building housing, okay? Now the question is, are they this housing using for the living, or just for investment? Because here in Indonesia it's different. There are a lot of apartments, they buy apartments, but it's just for rental. So for investment. And also there in America, it's a control that if you build housing, it must be for living, not for investment.
This is a continued concern in the U.S. There is a mix. Certainly, government-funded and supported housing is solely meant for people to live in, and it's typically either owned or if the government has a stake in it, the benefit has to go to the person that's living in it, and they have to be qualified. We're seeing, and this was actually really made a lot worse on the other end of the 2008 global housing and financial crisis. We're seeing the rise of even more aggressive housing investment. Where money in the past was going into investing in mortgage-backed securities, and we're now seeing it going into real estate investment trusts. And the real estate that's going into those trusts is coming from housing that's gone into foreclosure as a result of the global housing and financial crisis. So we're seeing quite a bit more of that type of investment activity happening. The curious thing is that it's happening in neighborhoods and types of housing stock where we haven't seen it before, which tends to be predominantly in single-family homes, where before it would be more so targeted towards multifamily homes within central cities. But the opportunity is there, and for many of the investors, the return on investment is also there. Within these central cores, kind of going back to what we were talking about, where we have lots of high value housing, we are seeing more evidence, akin to the stories we hear in many other cities, including places like London and New York and San Francisco and Vancouver, where there's a lot. Increasingly, there's a group of people that are investing and never intending to live in those units because they're basically walking safe deposit or physical safe deposit boxes. Their value is continually rising. The market is great in those places, and there's lots of money to be made. So we do see that happening kind of in some ways in contrast to the kind of more diffuse strategy of these real estate trusts that are now buying up what were once owner-occupied homes, but owners have been displaced by the housing crisis.
So, thank you for the presentations. They're interesting and I learned a lot. I have two questions. For Marc, I think I missed the shift between human capital and human development, but that's probably because, my very old readings about human capital basically suggests policymakers to basically create a formation of human capital, and that looks a lot like human development policies. So if you're willing to explain more about that. And for Andrew, I think you get lots of questions about racial segregation because unfortunately income mixing has been used as a counter argument against the idea that US housing has been racially segregated. And I think in different places now, also the conversations that we're having in Indonesia is, whether we do have racial segregation or whether it's just income inequality, for example. So if you're willing to, illuminate us a little bit on how the mechanism works, right? How can housing units be selectively marketed, and at the end of the day, you're looking at people with different ethnicities in different pockets of the city. So instead of just explaining kind of the diagnostics, probably tell us why we get the disease, right? That probably helps us to kind of create the same kind of diagnostics for different places around the world as well, which probably demonstrates the same kind of features, but we can't necessarily say they have the same mechanisms. Thank you.
Human capital theory from the outside looks a lot like human development theory, right? It's a little bit more focused on knowledge and on people as inputs to production and innovation, so it's kind of a theory for our times. But the shift you missed is simply the invention of policies, of ideas, of research, and of social movements that are forcing actual investment in human capital creation. So the irony in the United States of the human capital era of economic development was that even as people were, I will give you an example, the economist Ed Glazer, who talks about human capital nonstop, when Detroit went bankrupt, or when the state of Michigan made Detroit bankrupt, he was an advisor to the mayor, and he proposed closing the schools. So that was what human capital looked like in practice. It looked like a bunch of happy talk that got around the hard question of where human capital actually comes from. The human development turn is essentially a commitment and an understanding to actually creating human capital.
So on the question of how do we kind of disentangle this issue of income and race, this is really, this is, in the US at least, this is kind of a challenge for our times. So one of the things that I kind of talked about at the beginning of my presentation was the historic lack of access to capital, particularly for households and individuals of color. And so that meant that you couldn't go and get a bank loan, even if you were qualified, simply on the basis of things like your race. It meant that you were far, far more likely to face discrimination when in your real estate transactions on the basis of your race. And it also meant in many cases that you were actually going to pay more for the same price house than someone of another racial group. So the only reason I bring that stuff up is that these have really important connotations, not just for income, but what is really more important here, which is the question of wealth, right? Wealth that can be transferred on to future generations, and that forms the basis for longer-term durable advantage and disadvantage. And so the challenge that we face is that our fair housing laws say that we can in fact not discriminate on the basis of race. So even when we know that there has been systemic racial bias within our housing delivery system, now that cannot be a criteria for helping to address the problem itself, because it then opens up the hornet's nest of, well, if some people can use this in order to select certain people for programs, then why can't they disallow others, right? So this is part of the challenge. We can't selectively market housing on the basis of race. So to a large extent, we have to use income as a proxy. The type of racial sorting and filtering that we talked about also comes into play here in terms of we can kind of triangulate based upon where the housing opportunity is, who's likely going to select into it. Again, the challenge there is that it doesn't deal with the segregation issue. It might deal with the access issue, but not the segregation issue itself. So we just face this challenge. There's no better way to describe it than the whack-a-mole game that I used to play as a kid, right? You can maybe deal with the problem in one place, but then it's going to pop up someplace else. You can use one set of measures or one criterion to try to help to deal with that historic inequity, and then it's going to pop up someplace else or manifest itself with relationship to another group. So this is really the challenge. This is a major challenge that we face. This is one of the reasons I'm arguing here that these types of patterns remain so enduring. They remain so hard to break down. Even as governments are saying, we know we have to do this. It's simply that the toolkit is limited and the ways to target people are through these types of proxies, which means that you're basically using a machete to try to do microsurgery or neurosurgery. And that was not having anything to do with the reference to the current Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, who happens to be a neurosurgeon.
Any other questions? No? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, this marks the end of our public lecture, and on behalf of the organizer, we would like to thank both Mr. Doussard and Mr. Greenlee for delivering inspiring materials, and also for the distinguished guests and audience for being with us today.
I have something to add, actually.
Mohon maaf, saya cuma ingin menambahkan satu hal, tapi bukan pertanyaan. Sabrina adalah staf kami di Smart City. Boleh tolong buka website Smart City? Barangkali tadi saya sudah mendapatkan beberapa kali pertanyaan soalnya. Kalau kami ingin mendapatkan presentasinya, bagaimana caranya? Tolong bukain websitenya Smart City. Oke. Websitenya mudah. Websitenya adalah smartcity.ui.ac.id. Lalu kemudian setelah Bapak Ibu login, nanti ada bagian di gallery. Maaf, di resources, Sabrina. Resources, lalu bukan gallery, ada documents. Nanti akan di-upload di sini, itu saja. Jadi seandainya Bapak Ibu membutuhkan presentasinya, silakan buka smartcity.ui.ac.id, lalu kemudian klik resources, lalu kemudian masuk ke document. Mohon maaf, itu saja tambahannya.
Okay, so this marks the end of the public lecture. Thank you all for attending the public lecture, and may the knowledge we gained could be beneficial for us in the future.